On the morning of July 25th, 1944, Fritz Bayerlein stood at his command post west of Saint-Lô and watched the sky turn black with aircraft. He was 50 years old, a veteran of Poland, France, the Western Desert and the Eastern Front. He had served as Rommel's Chief of Staff in North Africa and had commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, the most elite armoured formation in the German army in the West, through 7 weeks of brutal fighting in the Norman hedgerows. He had seen everything the war had to offer. He was not prepared for what came next. The bombers came as if on a conveyor belt. He wrote those words after the war, and they are the most precise description of what carpet bombing looks like from the ground that any German officer ever produced. Back and forth the carpets were laid. Artillery positions were wiped out, tanks overturned and buried, infantry positions flattened, all roads and tracks destroyed. By midday, the entire area resembled a Mondlandschaft, a moonscape, with bomb craters touching rim to rim. All signal communications had been cut. No command was possible. Several of my men went mad and rushed round in the open until they were cut down by splinters. Over 70% of my soldiers were either dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed. In my opinion, he wrote, hell is not as bad as what we experienced. The survivors of the Panzer Lehr Division who were still functional after the bombardment ended behaved like lunatics and could not be deployed. The most elite armoured division in Army Group B had ceased to exist as a fighting formation in approximately 1 hour. Through the gap it had been defending, 120,000 American soldiers were about to pour. I have covered Normandy many times on this channel, the landings, the hedgerow fighting, the great armoured battles in the east around Caen, but there is a specific week in late July and early August 1944 that I have never covered properly, and the reason I have never covered it is that most of my research time goes into the Eastern Front, where I feel most at home. Stalingrad, Kursk, the collapse of Army Group Center. That is where I have spent most of my reading hours. The Normandy bridgehead fights are a different animal, faster, more chaotic, and in some ways more brutal than the grinding, attritional fighting in the East. I have been going through the accounts of what happened in those 10 days between July 25th and August 12th, 1944, and I want to show you what I found, because what happened to the German army in Normandy in those 10 days was one of the most complete military collapses of the entire war. And it happened to men who in some cases were fighting with an intensity and a ferocity that the Allied commanders had not anticipated, and whose accounts deserve to be heard properly. This is the story of those 10 days from both sides. The men who dropped the bombs, the men who were under them, the Americans trapped on a hill calling artillery strikes by sound and map coordinates for 5 days without food. The German Panther commander guiding his tank through a burning pocket, while aircraft killed everything around him. Both sides, no framing, just what happened. Here is the thing about Normandy that most people gloss over when they tell this story. 7 weeks after D-Day, the Allies had still not broken out. Not for lack of trying. The situation was a mess. The original American objectives for the first day of the invasion had still not been reached. The British and Canadians under Montgomery had tried 4 times to break through the German defences around Caen, and each time had been thrown back by the German armour that Hitler had concentrated in that sector. The American sector west of the British had become a nightmare of bocage fighting, the dense Norman hedgerow country, where each field was a fortress, and each road was a killing ground, and the tactical advantages of Allied armour and air power were negated by terrain that forced every engagement down to the level of individual soldiers killing each other at ranges of 50 metres. The American casualty rate in the bocage had been appalling. At Saint-Lô, which fell to the Americans on July 18th, the fighting had cost roughly 11,000 American casualties in 3 weeks of combat. The war correspondents were filing stories about stalemate. Senior Allied commanders were under political pressure. The breakout from Normandy that the invasion planners had assumed would happen within weeks of the landings had not materialised. The German situation was also not what anyone had planned, but for different reasons. The Wehrmacht had been fighting a fighting withdrawal since June 6th, giving ground slowly, counterattacking where possible, holding the line with a discipline and a tactical skill that had frustrated Allied commanders who had expected the German army to collapse under the weight of Allied material superiority. The men fighting in those hedgerows were not the broken remnants of a defeated force. They were professional soldiers using ground, cover and tactical experience to extract the maximum cost from every metre of territory the Allies gained, but they were running out of men, Every casualty the Wehrmacht took in Normandy was a casualty that could not be replaced at the same quality. The Allied bomber campaign against French rail infrastructure meant that German reinforcements moved slowly and arrived depleted. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a factor in the ground battle, and Hitler, who still believed that a second Allied landing was coming at Pas-de-Calais, was holding the entire German 15th Army in reserve to meet a threat that was not coming, keeping those divisions from the actual battle that was happening. Bradley's answer to this was Operation Cobra. The concept was simple, the scale was not. A carpet of bombs from the entire American strategic and tactical bomber force would be dropped on a specific narrow corridor west of Saint-Lô, approximately 6 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers deep. The bombing would destroy whatever was in that corridor. Immediately behind the bomb line, 6 American divisions would attack through the rubble. The breakthrough would be exploited by armoured columns driving south at maximum speed to Avranches at the southern tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, the gateway to the open country of France beyond the Bocage. Panzerlehr held the corridor Cobra was aimed at. Bayerlein had 11 battalions and around 40 operational tanks on the morning of July 25th. 3 defensive lines, his best infantry at the front, armour in small Kampfgruppen behind them to plug gaps, reserves and artillery in the third line. It had worked for 7 weeks in the Bocage. It was about to stop working in a way that no defensive system ever built could have survived. The bombing had actually been attempted on July 24th. The cloud cover over the target was too heavy, and Bradley called it off, but 1,500 bombers were already airborne, and some of them, flying parallel to the American front lines, had already dropped their loads when the recall order reached them. Some of those bombs fell short. 25 American soldiers were killed, and 131 were wounded by their own air force. The Germans in the target zone received 350 casualties and lost 10 armoured vehicles. Bayerlein, reading the pattern of the bombing, advanced his forward outposts overnight, in the mistaken belief that the Americans had completed their bombardment. He moved his forward line back into the corridor that was going to receive 1,000 times more ordnance the following morning. At 9:38 on July 25th, 1944, the bombardment began. 1,581 bombers in the first wave. The aircraft approached perpendicular to the front line rather than parallel, which was intended to reduce the time American bombers spent over American positions. It did not work perfectly. A formation of bombers dropped short of the target and killed Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the head of Army Ground Forces, who was visiting the front as part of a cover operation to convince the Germans that Patton's fictitious 1st United States Army Group was still planning a landing at Pas-de-Calais. McNair was the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre. He was found with his body shredded by American bombs in a foxhole barely 300 metres behind the front line. 111 American soldiers were killed by friendly fire, and 490 were wounded. The men who survived described the experience of being under a short bombing by their own air force as indistinguishable from being under a German artillery preparation. In the target zone, Bayerlein's Panzerlehr division ceased to exist. His after-action account is the most precise description of what the industrial application of air power does to human beings ever written by a man who was under it. The craters were touching rim to rim across a corridor 6 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers deep. Men who had survived the bombing sat in the craters they were in because there was nowhere to go and no way to know which direction was safe. Communications were gone. The regimental headquarters could not reach battalion. Battalion could not reach company. The company commanders who were still alive had no information about what was happening outside their immediate visual range. The artillery that Bayerlein had positioned to cover the attack corridors was either destroyed or its crews were among the 70% who were dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed. When the American infantry crossed the line of departure behind the bomb line and started moving through the rubble toward what had been the Panzerlehr's positions, they found craters, burning vehicles, and men who were not capable of coherent resistance. The few pockets that did resist were Kampfgruppe Heinz, positioned at the eastern edge of the bombing zone, and therefore outside the heaviest concentration, and some elements of the second defensive line who had been far enough behind the front to survive with their cohesion partially intact. The American infantry advance on the first day was cautious and slower than Bradley had hoped. for reasons that had nothing to do with German resistance and everything to do with the specific military psychology of men who had been fighting in the bocage for 7 weeks, and had learned from experience that an apparently broken enemy could still kill you. The 30th Infantry Division captured the village of Ebecrevon. The 4th Infantry Division encountered the remnants of Panzerlehr armour that had survived the bombing and defeated them with bazookas and Shermans. The 9th Infantry Division on the right bogged down against paratroopers from the German 5th Parachute Division, who had not been in the bombing corridor and were fighting with full effectiveness. At the end of the first day, the Americans had pushed approximately 1 mile beyond the Saint-Lô-Perrier road. The breakthrough that Cobra was designed to produce had not yet materialised. It came on the second day. On July 26th, the American commanders changed how they were fighting. Infantry rode on the tanks instead of following them. The 1st Infantry Division was clearing hedgerows at 3 minutes per field, something that had taken hours a few weeks earlier. Combat Command B of the 3rd Armoured Division led the push toward Marigny. The Sherman tanks that led this push had been modified with a specific weapon that American engineers had developed in response to the bocage problem. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron had designed a set of steel prongs welded from German beach obstacles onto the front of Sherman tanks. The modified tanks, which the crews called rhinos, could drive directly into a hedgerow at speed and cut through it rather than climbing over it and exposing their thin belly armour to German anti-tank weapons. The German tanks lacking this modification had to use the roads. On roads, German tanks were predictable. In the fields, the rhinos were not. By nightfall, on July 26th, the American armour was through Marigny and moving south. The rate of advance had shifted from meters per day to kilometers per hour. A German Kampfgruppe of 30 panzers tried to retake a crossroads near Notre-Dame-de-Senilly and was repulsed by American armoured infantry who held through the night. 2 batteries of M7 Priest self-propelled guns and 4 M10 tank destroyers held a position against a column from the 2nd SS Das Reich Division until reinforcements arrived. The German counterattacks that had held the line for 7 weeks in the bocage were now being absorbed and reversed in hours rather than days. On July 27th, the P-47 Thunderbolts found something they had been looking for since D-Day. Open ground, German vehicles moving in daylight on roads south of the bocage, where there was no cover and no hedgerows and no way to hide. 500 German vehicles were moving south, compressed onto the few roads available, unable to disperse because the fields were too boggy for wheeled transport, and the vehicle commanders knew that stopping meant being overrun by the American armour coming behind them. The 405th Fighter Group attacked from 1510 to 2140 on July 27th. By nightfall, the P-47s had destroyed 122 tanks, 259 other vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces in a single afternoon. British Typhoons from 121, Wing of 83 Group, flew 99 sorties and destroyed 17 more tanks and put 27 others out of service. The Roncey pocket was forming. Fritz Langanke was 25 years old, a Panther tank commander and officer cadet in the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. He had 7 years of service in the SS. He had fought in Russia and had survived the bocage fighting since June. On the night of July 28th, he found himself inside the pocket that the American armoured columns were closing around the surviving German forces north of the main breakout corridor. He gave his account to World War II magazine decades later, and it is the most precise German first-person account of what the Roncey pocket looked like from the inside. Early on the night of July 28th, Langanke said, "I was attached with my platoon of 4 Panthers of the 2nd Company, SS Panzer Regiment Das Reich, to the reinforced 3rd Battalion of SS Regiment Deutschland." The American encirclement of the bulk of those German units that had been north of the main breakthrough was nearly complete. The Roncey pocket was closing. Our task force, led by the commander of the 3rd Battalion, Major Helmut Schreiber, was ordered to take the route via Cerisy-la-Salle and Notre-Dame-de-Senilly toward Percy, where a new defence line was to be established. Many of the infantry fragments of divisions that roamed around in that area, as well as stragglers, were to be taken along. I set up a march formation. First my tank with grenadiers on the left side and about 50 to 60 paratroopers on the right side, as a safeguard against close combat fighters with bazookas. The rear was brought up by the Panzer IV and my second Panther. The frequency of our radio communication was set, and at 2200 hours we started. Of course, no scouts had moved at all before this. What Langanki was navigating was a pocket that had become a specific kind of hell. The town square at Roncey had filled with armour, supply vehicles and mechanised infantry from 3 divisions, the 2nd SS Das Reich, the 17th SS Götz von Berlichingen, and the 91st Luftlande Division, all trying simultaneously to find a way out of the encirclement. The roads were blocked, every intersection was contested, the vehicles that had been hit in the first air attacks were burning in the roads, and the vehicles behind them could not pass, and the vehicles behind those could not turn around because there was nothing behind them but more vehicles. The P-47s had found this compression of targets and had been working it for hours. German anti-aircraft capability in the pocket was minimal. The pilots could make their attack runs at low altitude and could take their time selecting targets because nothing was shooting back at them with any effectiveness. A German soldier in the pocket, whose letter home was preserved and later published, described what it looked like from inside one of the vehicles. As daylight broke, I could see the pale faces of our soldiers. That is when the Jabo fighter bombers attacked. More vehicles were hit, exploding bombs, blinding flashes, white-hot metal fragments piercing through our armour. Another camarade shredded by the attack. I saw a great panther knocked on its side as if it were a toy. Men were screaming from inside burning vehicles, a sound I will never forget. I remembered the smell of my father's slaughterhouse. I never liked it, being the son of a butcher, though I did as I was told. The SS gave me a way out of that. But the smell was the same. Langanki's account of navigating his Panther through this environment captures the specific violence of armoured fighting at night with aircraft overhead and American ground forces closing from multiple directions. The road was blocked for good after the first air attacks, he said. The planes could then quite calmly pick off target after target since there was no defence. For us on the ground it was terrible. Even artillery started to shell us. Here we had quite a lot of combat capacity, and yet no chance to use it. It was just being smashed. His Panther moved through the burning pocket in the dark. On the right side, a farm was in flames. In the wavering light, I thought I saw a Sherman in the field to the left. We fired twice and hit it, but it did not burn. Then I drove full speed across the Hamby-Roncey road, where I expected stiff American resistance, and, if I remember correctly, we rolled over an anti-tank gun. I shot into the lane that led into the main road from the other side and stopped. Passing the intersection, I saw 2 Shermans to my right side standing at right angles, sticking their heads into the hedgerow. I realised these were the machine guns that had fired at our paratroopers when we started and had wounded a number of them. The second Panther that took part in the breakout was the only one from my platoon left, Langanki said. The commander's name was Panzer. Sounds funny. The other Panthers were stuck in traffic or mechanically disabled. For his role in guiding hundreds of German soldiers out of the Roncey pocket, Langanke was recommended for the Knight's Cross on August 7th, 1944, and received it on August 27th. Most of those he had fought alongside were not so fortunate. The German dead from the Roncey pocket are mostly in the cemetery at Marigny. There are 9,100 graves. The 2nd SS Das Reich Division lost 2/3 of its weapons and equipment in the pocket. The pocket of death, as one German account described it, had consumed armoured units that had been fighting continuously since D-Day. The machines that had survived 7 weeks in the bocage and had held the line while the Allied generals searched for a way through were gone, in 2 days of open ground fighting against an air force that could now see them clearly. By July 29th, lead elements of the 4th Armoured Division had entered Avranches and found it undefended. The civilians of a liberated French city greeted American soldiers with tricolours and cheers. The Cotentin Peninsula was behind the Americans, France was in front of them. Bradley turned the 8th Corps over to Patton and activated the 3rd Army. Patton stood in the middle of a traffic jam in Avranches, directing convoys himself, funneling 100,000 men and 20,000 vehicles across a single bridge, and the soldiers who drove past him cheered. He sent the armoured spearheads racing toward Brittany and its deep water ports. The breakout from the bocage that had seemed impossible 7 weeks after D-Day had happened in 4 days. In Berlin, Hitler looked at the map and decided that the correct response to the collapse of the Normandy front was to attack. Operation Lüttich was the product of a military logic that only made sense if you believed that the Allied advance could be reversed by a single, successful armoured thrust. Hitler's analysis was that the American armoured spearheads racing south and then west into Brittany had created a corridor anchored at Avranches that, if severed, would cut off Patton's entire Third Army from its supply base. He ordered 4 panzer divisions, the 2nd Panzer, the 2nd SS Das Reich, the 1st SS Leibstandarte, and the 116th Panzer to assemble west of Mortagne and attack east through the town to Avranches. 20 kilometres of road. Cut the road and the Third Army died. Field Marshal Günther von Klug, commanding Army Group B, knew the plan was catastrophically wrong. The divisions Hitler was ordering into the attack were the ones that had been fighting and losing since D-Day. The 2nd SS Das Reich had just lost 2/3 of its equipment in the Roncey pocket. The 116th Panzer had been fighting continuously for 7 weeks. The other divisions were in similar condition. The Allied air forces would find the attacking panzers in exactly the kind of open terrain where P-47s had destroyed 122 tanks in a single afternoon 3 days earlier. Von Kluge told Hitler this. Hitler told him to attack. At 1 o'clock on August 7, 1944, approximately 26,000 German infantry and 300 panzers moved toward Mortagne and the positions of the American 30th Infantry Division. The attack started at night specifically to avoid the P-47s. For the Germans, almost nothing went right. Of 6 attacking columns, only 3 moved forward on schedule. The 116th Panzer Division on the right flank did not advance at all. The 2nd SS Das Reich, committed to the southern column, fought its way into Mortagne itself. The 2nd Panzer Division advanced 4 miles in the north against the most determined resistance the 30th Division could offer. The Americans at Saint-Barthélemy, a crossroads 2 miles north of Mortagne, held for 6 hours against the full weight of the German attack and destroyed 40 panzers. At Abbaye Blanche, a 66-man platoon armed with bazookas forced an entire SS regiment to withdraw. The German armour had experienced similar punishment on the Eastern Front and had absorbed it. By the early hours of August 7th, the German attack had made local gains and had driven a wedge into the 30th Division's positions, and in the pre-dawn darkness it looked momentarily as though the thrust toward Avranches might be working. On a rocky hill 1 mile east of Mortagne, roughly 700 men of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment had spent the previous day digging in on a position they had been ordered to hold as an observation post. The hill was called Montjoie by the locals, a name given by medieval pilgrims who climbed it to catch their first sight of the abbey at Mont Saint-Michel, 27 miles distant. The Americans called it Hill 314, after its height in meters. The view from the summit extended 15 miles in every direction across the Norman plains, which was the reason the 2nd Battalion was there and the reason the German attack was going to have to deal with them. Among the men on the hill was 2nd Lieutenant Robert L. Weiss, 21 years old, a forward observer for the 231st Field Artillery Battalion. He was wearing the same wool serge shirt his father, a Jewish immigrant from Hungary, had worn in the First World War. He was carrying a 35-pound SCR 610 radio in a saddle-soaped leather case. The radio had a 5-mile range, just enough to reach the howitzer batteries dug into the west. If the radio worked and Weiss could see what was moving on the roads below the hill, the 231st Field Artillery Battalion could hit anything in the German attack corridor. The Germans understood this immediately. The 2nd SS Panzer Division struck Mortagne at 1 o'clock and captured the battalion command post inside the town in the first hour. The main body of the 2nd Battalion on Hill 314 was surrounded by dawn. Captain Reynolds C. Erickson, the senior surviving officer, took command of the position. He organised the defence into 3 company perimeters. Lieutenant Ralph Curley's E Company covered the southeast. Lieutenant Ronald Woody's G Company covered the southwest. Lieutenant Joseph Reese's K Company covered the north. The men had bazookas and mortars and whatever personal weapons they had carried up the hill. They had Weiss and his radio. From the summit, the view that made Hill 314 militarily significant was fully visible in the dawn light. German columns moving on the roads below were exposed and identifiable. Curley wrote about what he saw when the fog lifted that first morning. Whether the enemy was ignorant of the fact that Hill 314 was occupied, or had simply chosen to ignore it, is not known and really does not matter. His closed formations made a definite target for our artillery. Weiss began calling fire missions at dawn. He was working by sound and map coordinates because the German positions were not always visible through the hedgerows and the smoke. He called in battery after battery against the German columns attempting to move south toward Avranches on the roads below. The artillery strikes that his radio calls produced were landing precisely on the German axis of advance. Every German unit that tried to move south through the Mortagne corridor was being met by American artillery, directed from an observation post they could see but could not yet silence. General Eberbach, commanding the German 5th Panzer Army and given responsibility for the Lüttich counterattack, understood that Hill 314 had to fall before the attack could proceed. He sent the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division to take it. The 17th SS threw a regiment-sized force at the hill. The terrain worked against them. Hill 314 was a mile-long escarpment of craggy limestone with limited approach routes and no cover on the upper slopes. Every approach could be covered by fire from the defenders and registered for artillery. The German infantry came up the slopes in assault waves and were met by the defenders' small arms and, when the range was sufficient, by the artillery that Weiss was still calling from the summit. "You could see the attack coming," one of the defenders recalled. "I would just put as much artillery into the area as I could. German tanks were very quiet and could slip up on you." The Germans brought 88mm guns to direct fire against the summit. White phosphorus shells burned some of the Americans on the exposed rock positions. Weiss found cover from the burning particles and called a fire mission on the enemy howitzers. "Every time we saw the Germans forming up for an attack," recalled one soldier, "we would drop a few shells on top of them. The radio was working, the artillery was answering, the hill was holding." The supply situation deteriorated from the first day. The encircled battalion could not be reached by ground. Artillery crews at the 230th Field Artillery Battalion attempted to fire supply canisters stuffed with food, ammunition and medical supplies to the hilltop. The contents were either crushed on impact or scattered across the summit in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. 12 C-47 aircraft attempted supply drops from the air on the afternoon of August 7th, using blue and orange parachutes. Most of the parachutes drifted into no man's land. Some drifted into German-held territory. Observation aircraft attempted direct drops, but were driven off by German anti-aircraft fire. One observation pilot was shot down and captured. By August 9th, the men on Hill 314 had been without food for 2 days, and were rationing their ammunition carefully, searching the bodies of their dead for rounds, before placing them in the makeshift morgue they had built among the rocks, so the living could not see the accumulating dead. At one point, the situation became sufficiently critical that an American officer called artillery fire down directly on the battalion command post, because German infantry had reached close enough to the summit that the command post position had become a viable target. The artillery battery on the other end of the radio received the coordinates for the position it had been supporting for 3 days and fired them. On August 9th, a German SS officer climbed the hill under a white flag to demand the surrender of the American forces on the summit. He was escorted to Lieutenant Curley, the senior officer available at that moment. Curley sent the SS officer back down the hill with a stream of profanity as his answer. The Germans responded by bringing everything they had against the summit. The defenders held. The deterioration of the German position at Mortagne was accelerating outside the hill. When the fog burned off on the morning of August 7th, the P-47s went into action against the attacking panzers in exactly the environment the German commanders had feared and the Allied air commanders had been waiting for. German armour moving in open ground with no air cover and no meaningful anti-aircraft defence was destroyed piecemeal across the entire attack corridor. By the evening of August 8th, the German assault had consumed what remained of the attacking division's offensive capability, and had achieved nothing. Von Kluge reported to Hitler that the attack had failed. Hitler ordered him to renew it. Von Kluge told his staff that they must risk everything even though he knew the battle was lost. He formed a new Kampfgruppe under General Eberbach and ordered it to continue the offensive. The new Kampfgruppe could not reverse what had happened to the attacking force in 48 hours of fighting. It had no more operational capacity than the formations it was cobbled together from. The 30th Division had suffered 1,800 casualties across the entire Mortagne battle. Other American units engaged in the fighting had suffered comparable losses. The German losses in men, armour and irreplaceable experienced personnel had been catastrophic, not just at Mortagne, but across the entire Cobra to Lüttich sequence of operations. The 4 panzer divisions committed to Operation Lüttich had entered the battle already degraded by 7 weeks of bocage fighting. They came out of it with a fraction of their remaining armour and with casualty lists that included officers and NCOs who could not be replaced. On August 12th, the Germans at Mortain called off the attack and began withdrawing east. A relief regiment from the 35th Division climbed to the summit of Hill 314 and began carrying the wounded down. 300 casualties were carried. 370 walking wounded made it down on their own. The men who had held the hill for 5 days, who had called artillery from the summit until their ammunition was rationed by counting the rounds in the pockets of dead men, came off the hill looking like what they were, which was men who had not slept or eaten in 5 days while being attacked by an SS division. Weiss had kept his radio working for 120 hours. The artillery he directed from the summit had not merely held Hill 314, it had disrupted the entire southern axis of the German counterattack. The fire missions he called had landed on roads the panzer columns needed to use, on assembly areas the German infantry needed to form up in, on approach routes the attacking regiments needed to advance through. The Germans could not silence the observation post on the summit, and could not advance south while it was functioning. Hill 314 had not just been held, it had been weaponized by a 21-year-old lieutenant with a 35-pound radio and a view of 15 miles of Normandy Plain. Bradley ordered Patton to shift his forces from Brittany to Le Mans on August 12th, the same day the Mortain fighting ended. The strategic implication of the German counterattack having failed at Mortain was that the German forces in Normandy were now exposed to encirclement. Patton's Third Army, swinging east while the British and Canadians pressed south from Caen, created the possibility of closing a pocket around the bulk of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. The Falaise pocket that closed in mid-August 1944 was the result of that opportunity. Inside it, German formations that had been fighting since D-Day were destroyed entirely. The Wehrmacht in the west did not recover from what happened in Normandy in those 10 days. It never held a coherent defensive line in France again. The German military cemetery at Marigny contains 9,100 graves. Most of the men in those graves died between July 25th and August 15th, 1944. The Panzer Lehr Division, which Bayerlein described with the precision of a man still not quite believing what had happened to him, lost over 2,000 men in a single morning and ceased to exist as an operational formation. The 2nd SS Das Reich had lost the majority of its equipment in the pocket west of Roncey. The 4 divisions committed to Operation Lüttich emerged from it fit for nothing. Bayerlein survived the war. He was captured by the Americans in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945 and spent 2 years in captivity before being released. He spent the post-war decades giving interviews and writing accounts of the Panzer Lehr's fighting, including the Cobra bombing, with the specific precision of a man who had processed a specific experience for years and was determined that people understand exactly what it had been. He died in 1970. Fritz Langanker survived the war. He received his Knight's Cross in August 1944 and continued fighting with the 2nd SS Das Reich through the autumn and winter of 1944 into 1945. He gave his account of the Roncey pocket decades later with the same clarity that the experience of navigating a burning pocket in a Panther tank in the middle of the night tends to produce in the men who lived through it. Robert Weiss survived the war. He went home to a life that the men in the Marigny cemetery did not get to have. He kept his father's wool shirt. The German dead from Operation Cobra number in the thousands, and most of them are in that cemetery at Marigny, with its 9,100 graves. The marble markers are small and close together, and they cover 8 hectares of Norman farmland. Men from the Panzer Lehr who were in the target corridor on July 25th are in that ground. Men from the Roncey pocket who could not get their tanks out. Men from the divisions that attacked Mortain on Hitler's orders against the advice of every general officer who understood what was left of the attacking force. The war in the West did not end at Normandy, but the possibility that it would end differently did. The specific geography of what the American advance looked like from the ground on the 3rd and 4th days of Cobra has been documented in divisional histories and unit after-action reports with enough detail to see what it meant for the men moving through it. The 2nd Armoured Division, that was closing the southern jaw of the Roncey encirclement, was moving through countryside that looked nothing like the bocage it had been fighting in for 7 weeks. The roads were open, the fields were larger, the horizon was visible. For soldiers who had spent their combat experience fighting from hedgerow to hedgerow in fields so small that the opposite end was within grenade range, the experience of open terrain was disorienting in both directions simultaneously. The space that made them feel exposed also meant the German positions they had been unable to flank in the bocage could now be outflanked. The tactical logic of the bocage had been reversed, and the American commanders who understood this pressed their advantage without stopping. Major General Edward Brooks, commanding the 2nd Armoured Division, was directing his combat commands from a position far enough forward that he could see the terrain personally. His after-action report noted that the rate of advance on July 27th exceeded anything the division had achieved since landing in Normandy. The specific reason was not German weakness alone. The Rhino modification to the Shermans had made the American tanks capable of moving through terrain that the German panzers had to go around. The P-47 air cover had removed the German ability to concentrate armour at threatened points. The combination of those two factors with the speed of the advance produced a situation where German commanders at divisional and corps level were issuing orders to units that no longer held the positions the orders assumed they held. The specific chaos of the German command situation during Cobra has been documented in the captured operational diaries of the German 7th Army. On July 27th, the 7th Army headquarters received situation reports from 3 different corps headquarters that contradicted each other about the location of the front line. One corps reported holding a defensive position that another corps had reported was overrun 4 hours earlier. The communications infrastructure that the Panzer-Lehr's-Bayer line had noted was destroyed by the bombing had not been restored. Motorcycle dispatch riders were carrying orders that arrived hours after the situations they described had changed. Division commanders were making tactical decisions based on information that was incomplete and often incorrect. The coherent defensive system that had held the Allies in the bocage for 7 weeks was not losing its physical positions. It was losing the information and communication infrastructure that made a defensive system function as a system, rather than as isolated positions fighting independently. The 30th Infantry Division that bore the main weight of the German Lüttich counterattack at Mortain had been in continuous combat since D-Day. The division's regimental histories document a specific quality of experience that produced the specific quality of defence Hill 314 demonstrated. The men of the 120th Infantry who climbed Hill 314 on August 6th and 7th were not fresh troops making a stand in unfamiliar circumstances. They were professional soldiers who had been fighting for 2 months and who had developed a specific intuitive understanding of German tactical patterns. When the German attack came at 1 o'clock on August 7th, and the battalion command post in Mortain was overrun in the first hour, the companies on the hill did not panic. They organised their perimeters, established their fields of fire, and began the process of making their position as expensive as possible to attack. This was not heroism in any abstract sense. It was the specific competence that comes from 2 months of continuous combat. The artillery forward observer team on Hill 314 consisted of Weiss and his partner, First Lieutenant Charles Bartz, each controlling a different battery. Bartz handled Battery C of the 231st Field Artillery Battalion, while Weiss handled Battery B. The 2 observers covered different sectors of the terrain below the hill and coordinated their fire missions to prevent duplication and to ensure continuous coverage of the approach routes. The specific radio procedure they used, transmitting map coordinates and adjustments to gunners they could not see, with shells landing in positions they could observe only approximately in the smoke and hedgerows, required a level of technical skill and situational awareness that 5 days without sleep and food did not diminish. When the radio batteries began to die on August 10th, the men on the hill sent out a patrol specifically to recover radio batteries from dead soldiers in positions below the summit. The patrol took casualties getting to the batteries and took casualties getting back. The batteries were recovered and Weiss kept transmitting. The specific numbers of the German losses between July 25th and August 15th, 1944 are in the German casualty records and the captured equipment inventories that American forces compiled as they moved through the areas of the fighting. In the Roncey pocket alone, the count of destroyed or captured equipment included more than 100 tanks and self-propelled guns, 250 other armoured vehicles, and quantities of artillery and soft-skin transport that the German units in the pocket had been operating with since D-Day. The men who died with their equipment in the pocket are the majority of those 9,100 graves at Marigny. The equipment that burned in the roads and fields outside Roncey on July 28th and 29th was equipment that could not be replaced. Germany was producing tanks in 1944, but not at a rate that could replace what the Normandy fighting was consuming. And the factories producing them were being bombed by the same air forces that were destroying them in Normandy.